What would you say, starting high level, are the most exciting discoveries or trends in brain health research that you're currently involved with?
Yeah, I think there's a few, and probably the one that's most relevant to the audience is thinking about long-term cognitive function and cognitive decline, and the variables that go into that. And what I think we've seen historically is that we get these long lists of risk factors, and we're told, these are all the things you should do, and these like epically long lists that are very daunting about all these things we should do to protect the brain. But nobody really thinks about, well, how do all these risk factors fit together, and how, like, do they just stack up linearly, like we have to do all of them, or do they interact in some way? And I think the more I work in this field, and the more I work with others in this field, the more you see that obviously the brain is a very complex thing, and there are these interesting interactions between all these factors. So you have to kind of build, or what we're building is what we call a systems model, right? You can't just have these lists of risk factors. You have to think about how all these things interact. And then, hopefully, once you put all those things in place, or you have some idea of a more comprehensive model, you can start to ideally slow cognitive decline and maybe prevent dementia entirely.
Wow. So for somebody who is looking to improve their brain health, but unsure of where to start, where would you say they start?
When I think about what the brain needs to function, I have this simplified model in my head that has kind of 3 buckets. And I start with the model because each person probably has some slightly different things. Their rate limiting step might be slightly different. So the 3 buckets are what I call cognitive demand, and then supply and support. So the thing that I've worked on the most recently, and a lot of this work is with my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Josh Turknett, who's a neurologist. We've published some papers on this about an idea that the function of the brain is really demand driven, and the output, cognitive function, is dependent on how you use your brain, essentially. And we kind of know this, right? Everybody's like, oh, you've got to stay engaged. When you retire, you've got to do some Sudoku and that kind of stuff. But I think it's really more fundamentally critical than that. And the way I think about it, and there are lots of parallels, like biochemical, physiological, functional, between how you improve brain function and how you improve physical function. So just like you would say that exercise or physical activity is the primary driver of physical function and physical health and physical performance, how you use and train and create demand in the brain is the primary driver of cognitive function. And so it's not just an important piece of the puzzle. I think it's the main driver of how your brain functions. So you need to think about how you might, for want of a better term, train the brain, just like you would train the body. So that's the first bucket. Then when you train, in order for the brain, just like for the muscles to respond, you need blood flow, you need nutrients, you need oxygen and all these other things. So that kind of goes in my supply bucket. So you need a healthy cardiovascular system, and then you need nutrients from the diet that are important for structural components and also functional components of, like, for the cells in the brain to function. So critical things like B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, things like that. And then you need a healthy metabolism so that you're supplying, be it glucose or ketones or lactate or whatever it is that your brain is running on primarily. Those need to get where they need to go. And when a certain area of the brain is active, you have this thing called neurovascular coupling. So the neurons that are active in that region essentially ask for more blood flow, and you need a healthy vascular system to respond appropriately and send the resources into the right place. Then the final bucket is what I call the support bucket. And that's like saying, when you train in the gym, that's not when you get stronger. When you get stronger is when you recover afterwards, right? And so this is the same. And periods of rest and recovery are when you get neuroplasticity, when you get the development of new connections in the brain. And sleep is probably the most critical part of that. But other things you might think about here are particularly avoiding issues that might inhibit that process. So chronic stress, significant systemic inflammation, oxidative stress, smoking, excess alcohol, these kinds of things, they tend to inhibit that kind of recovery process. So those are like the main buckets. And then people might think, well, where do I fit in there? Where's the thing that sounds like, or maybe that's not the area that I've attended to as much as I could, and then that's where I would start. If you're trying to think of, pick the lowest hanging fruit, and that's probably where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck.
Well, when it comes to cognitive demand and training the brain, so to speak, what are we talking about specifically?
The funny thing about cognitive function is that, and brain health more generally, is that it's quite difficult to define. There are some basic functions that we all need in order to survive in the world. We need some aspects of memory, and we need some aspects of executive function and decision making, and we can measure all of these things in standardized tests, and we do that. But that's doesn't necessarily get to the real core of what you want your brain to do. So I define brain health as having a brain that does what you want it to do when you want it to do it. And it's purposefully vague, because what you want your brain to do isn't necessarily the same thing as I want my brain to do, right? So there are some really core features of initial cognitive development, and a lot of my work is in neonatal and developmental neuroscience, so thinking about how does the brain develop in the first place. And these are the same things that seem to be really critical for long-term cognitive function. So if you think about when your brain is first developing, you create incredible cognitive demand, learning how to walk, learning how to talk, learning social interaction. These are like core skills that really drive how your brain develops. And then those same inputs seem to be really critical throughout the lifespan. So we know that social connection and social support are really critical for brain function, but we also see broad benefits from learning languages, from learning music, from learning complex motor skills. So physical activity is very important for the brain, but if you have an activity that's just as physically demanding and you add on a significant motor or coordination component, it seems to have a bigger benefit for the brain, because you're directly stimulating the brain in addition to the benefits coming from exercise. So it's these, I think they're very core human activities, and they're really the things that seem to drive cognitive function the most.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, when we think about exercise, usually, at least me, I think of resistance training, I think of cardiovascular training, but you're talking about a form of exercise that integrates physical demand with cognitive demand.
Yeah. So we actually just published a paper defining the ways that resistance training seems to protect areas of the brain that are susceptible in cognitive decline. But when you look at large meta-analyses of interventional studies and cognitive function, the type of activity that has the biggest benefit is what they call coordinative exercise, and some people call open skill exercise. So a closed skill exercise is those unimodal things like weight training, but also generally that it's an aerobic training like cycling or running. You're just doing the same thing in the same direction, right? And you know that your mind can kind of switch off and wander in those kind of scenarios. You can sort of feel it. But coordinative exercise or open skill exercise, it's usually a ball sport or a team sport. You're having to react to the environment. The
martial arts,
absolutely. Skateboarding, snowboarding, probably surfing, anything like that. But interestingly, and it's the same for both mental health and for cognitive function, the exercise with the biggest effect size, not that it's like significantly better than these other activities, but the one that sort of seems to move the needle the most is dancing. And it's probably because you have the coordination component, you have the physical component, you have a social interaction component, you have a music component. All of these things are really beneficial for the brain. So dancing really seems to be quite magical in terms of cognitive function.
There's also a lot of evidence supporting Tai Chi, I think particularly in Parkinsonism.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because I've always kind of wondered why.
Yeah.
Why it seems that Tai Chi might have this special additive effect in that context. But I guess because it is in a way kind of like a dance,
Yeah, you have this complex coordination. You don't have to do Tai Chi socially, but it's often done socially. And there seems to be there's a meditative component that's part of it as well. And there are actually several studies looking at Tai Chi, not just in Parkinsonism, but also in those either at risk of cognitive decline or with some element of cognitive impairment, and they see significant benefit.
So interesting. I've always been a weight trainer. I mean, for as long as I can pretty much remember, since I'm 16 years old, I've resistance training has been my preferred exercise modality, but mid 2020 I took up boxing. I've never done any other form of martial art, but I noticed very clearly and early on that aside from the really potent cardiovascular workout that it gives you, the cognitive benefits that I, just the mental stretching that had to occur for me to integrate like all these different, movements that I'd never previously done. It was profound. It was like really super noticeable.
Yeah. I don't think people who don't do these sports really appreciate how difficult it is to coordinate your body like that in 3D space, especially as you get to sort of the upper levels of difficulty. Of course, the downside of boxing is getting punched in the head, which is a separate issue for cognitive function. But
I did get hit in the head once, and I stopped. I stopped right after that. I was like, I have no intention of doing this like in any kind of professional or competitive way. And the risk of getting hit in the head, especially for me, because I'm an ApoE4 carrier, which you want to protect your head.
Yeah, absolutely. When I have some friends who took up boxing actually, and one of them is also an ApoE4 carrier, and I immediately told him, if nobody should get punched in the head for a living unless they really have to or they really want to, but particularly those people should probably try and avoid it.
What about playing music, learning a musical instrument?
Yeah, there's one of my favorite ever studies. Looked at the brains of musicians, and they did this. They did an MRI scan, and then there's a machine learning algorithm that's been used now in dozens, if not hundreds, of studies called brain age, and it's essentially very similar to like biological age, epigenetic age, some of these tests that people are doing, but with MRI scans. And you train the model, and then you give it a new MRI scan, and you say, how old does this brain look? And they did this on a group of individuals in their 30s, and they had just a normal control group. Then they had amateur musicians and professional musicians. And what they saw was that the musicians had younger looking brains than the control group. But there was an even bigger benefit, statistically significantly younger looking brains in the amateurs compared to the professionals.
Wow.
And the hypothesis of the authors was that it's harder for the amateurs to play music. So it's more of a cognitive challenge, because once you become a professional, some of this is automatic, especially simpler pieces, you're not always stretching yourself. Whereas for the amateurs, they're more likely to be stretching themselves, and therefore they're getting these additional benefits.
Wow. I learned to play guitar when I started when I was in my early 20s, and I started to sing as well. And it's one of my favorite things to do, and I definitely feel like it in some way is has boosted my cognitive abilities, but also, even today when I practice, like I make a point to practice, to not just do the things that I know that I'm already competent at and good at, but to try to stretch myself, which isn't quite as fun, because I think you enjoy doing what it is that you're good at. Yeah. But yeah, that's super interesting.
I think there's a really important lesson there. I will say, so I mentioned Dr. Turkner earlier, and he recently retired from clinical practice, and he primarily runs online banjo training sessions. So he has a whole platform to teach people how to play the banjo using sort of like the optimal neuroscience of learning, because he's an exceptionally good musician and feels so passionately about how music can help the brain. But more broadly than that, I think one of the reasons why we see this steady decline in cognitive function at the population level from about the end of when we finish formal education is because we spend less time and often no time doing things that we suck at, because adults hate doing things that they suck at and having other people see them do things like sucking at stuff, right? But that the friction of doing things incorrectly, not only does that activate a whole bunch of neurotransmitters, but it's a really important part of learning. And I think that is the main thing that we're missing. Like the exact, whether you pick up music or language or dance, I think that matters less. I think it's more of really pushing ourselves right at the edges of our current capabilities. And yes, that includes the necessity of making mistakes, of failing, because that is what really seems to drive neuroplasticity. And then, ideally long-term cognitive function.
Wow. Do more of the things that you suck at.
Exactly.
Provided it's safe.
Yeah,
You're
of
not
course.
risking physical harm.
Yeah, if don't like take up parkour if that's not something that's like really in your skill set.
Wow, that is very interesting. It's so true. Adults typically will shy away from things that they're not good at. I know that I'm certainly guilty of that. Very interesting. What about, there's been, I know as of 2020, hearing loss has been identified as a risk factor for cognitive decline. Any explanation for that you're familiar with?
Yeah, vision loss seems to come along with that as well. And for both, they've done some randomized controlled trials. They're difficult to do at the kind of scale that you might need to do. But for both cataract surgery for those who have cataracts and then hearing aids for those who have age-related hearing loss like presbyocusis, if you have those conditions, you're at an elevated risk of dementia. And if you can reverse them, either with surgery or with a hearing aid, then that seems to reverse some of that risk. There are a few reasons why that might be. You could think of it as being directly related to cognitive demand and cognitive input, right? You've just lost essentially an entire sense, right? So those inputs to the brain have been lost. And just like muscles, when you stop going to the gym, right, those areas of the brain are going to atrophy if they're not getting continued inputs. So that's probably part of it. And then another big part, and I have a very good friend who is an expert in the field of social connection and compassionate communities called Dr. Julian Abel. And when I talk about these things and cognitive demand, he's like, yeah, but when you lose your sight and you lose your hearing, you stop interacting with people, right? You stop socializing, you stop going out into the world, having conversations, meeting people. And that's probably a really critical part as well. So parts of it may be a direct loss of function because you don't have inputs. And then another part being how you interact with the world, how that changes as you start to lose a sense.
Do you think that supporting eye health and hearing via whichever means possible then could potentially play a disease modifying or preventative role? Yeah,
absolutely. And particularly with the eye, the eye is an extension of the brain. So anything that you're doing to support eye health is probably then going to also have a knock-on benefit for the brain and hearing similarly. So yes, we can address these issues if they arise, but anything that you can do to prevent that from happening in the first place is also probably going to be beneficial.
Wow. Well, talk to us about your background, because you're a medical doctor as well, right? On top of being a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
And I know you've studied at some pretty legit institutions. So yeah, walk us through that.
Sure. So yeah, my undergraduate degree, so I grew up in the UK primarily. And my undergraduate degree I specialized in biochemistry. This was at the University of Cambridge. And then I went to the University of Oxford for medical school. And during that time, I became increasingly interested in physical performance. I was a rower at college, and then I started to coach rowing, mainly at when I was at medical school. I was the head coach of the medical school boat club, and so I had these kind of like parallel tracks of like the formal physician and science, and then the sort of interest in athletic performance and human health more broadly, and some of that developed when I was an undergrad. And when you go to med school, they're like, well, why do you want to be a doctor? And I was like, well, I want to help people be healthier. And that's not really what doctors do, unfortunately. They do a very important job, but that's not really what they do. They certainly, there isn't much space for prevention in the current healthcare system, as I'm sure everybody is aware of. So I did work as a junior doctor in central London for a couple of years. And then I was offered a PhD in physiology at neuroscience at the University of Oslo. And this was a lab that I had done some work in as an undergrad. It had then been in Bristol in the UK, and the professor had moved to Norway and offered me a PhD. So I didn't really know what I wanted to specialize in yet, and you specialize slightly later in the UK as a doctor than you do in the US. So I went over and started my PhD, and while I was working on that, and this is sort of animal models of brain injury, trying to figure out ways to treat primarily neonatal brain injury, so brain injury in newborn babies. I was also still interested in these other aspects of health and performance. So rather than being on night shifts and running around wards in the hospital, I'm now sat at a computer in front of PubMed, and I can sort of start to dig into some of these other interests that I have. So I started a podcast and a blog. And through that, I joined and then helped build a company that worked with athletes to try and improve all aspects of their health and performance. And this is everybody from weekend warriors through to some sort of top level, elite level, world champion athletes and Olympians in various sports. And then that sort of continued as I finished my PhD. I moved to the US. And I did a postdoc and like continued that formal academic career. And I now run a lab at the University of Washington. That was the lab that I joined originally. But at the same time, sort of kept this parallel track in performance. So I work still as a performance consultant for professional athletes, primarily in Formula One, but also a little bit in some other sports. And then over time, these tracks have kind of, what's nice about being a professor is that you can kind of do whatever you want as long as you can get somebody to fund you for it. So I've now started to broaden the scope of the work that we do in terms of brain health, so brain health across the lifespan, as well as working in things like traumatic brain injury and these other things that are obviously relevant to athletes, but also other people like the military, and sort of trying to bring all these different pieces together. So what are the core lifestyle and environmental components that contribute to brain health at all of these stages? And then through that, I also helped found the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, which is now the fastest growing lifestyle medicine society in the world, and recently joined on the scientific advisory board of a big dementia prevention charity, again in the UK. And we have a very large research database that I helped to run.
What's that charity called?
It's called Food for the Brain.
Wow.
Run by Patrick Holford or founded by Patrick Holford. And the idea, or at least my role, is we have the charity has this free validated online cognitive function test. People can go and do the test, and then there's also a very extensive lifestyle questionnaire, 144 questions, I think. And we now have hundreds of thousands of responses for these things. Obviously, this is a certain demographic, very highly motivated people who are really interested in preserving long-term cognitive function. But now we have this really exciting database that we can start to do research in that we haven't yet, but that's something that we're going to start doing soon.
Wow. And where did your interest in the brain come from?
It mainly came from, I guess, essentially doing this PhD. And I'd never intended to do anything related to the brain. Like when I was trained to be a doctor and I was working as a junior doctor, I thought, I'm interested in anesthesiology, critical care. I was really interested in physiology in particular, so how we might, monitor and manipulate that as needed in sort of like in critical injuries. But this lab that I did my PhD in, I'd originally joined it as an undergrad because I got a welcome biomedical research scholarship. It's basically they give some money to undergrads so they can do some research in the summers. And my mum didn't want me to be away from home during the summer because I was away during the semester as well. So she got me a position in her friend's lab, who is a neuroscientist and worked in this field. And so I essentially just kind of fell into it. And then I got the offer of the PhD and still wasn't sure that I wanted to work in the brain. But then the more time I spent, doing the sort of the hardcore academic work, the more I realized that these other things I was interested in that were related to health and performance were so critical for the brain, obviously now. But equally, when you look at neurology and neuroscience, it's so heavily siloed, right? You have people who just study Alzheimer's disease or just study Parkinson's disease or just study some of these neonatal brain injuries that we study. And actually, there are these incredible commonalities across all these things that are important for both brain development and then also maintaining and then recovery from, say, a concussion, and then maintaining brain health later in life and cognitive function as we get older. That's where I really started to see, this is where I can have a place where I can sort of tie some of these things together, because I have experience across a broader range than just like one very small piece of neuroscience, which is important to do, but I think we can probably gain more by seeing the bigger picture.
When it comes to dementia prevention, what would you say are the big levers for most people?
When you look at the data that are out there, and there are several people who've tried to answer this question, and all of them get a slightly different answer, but there's certainly some overlap. So examples include the Livingston report was done by the Lancet. It was a Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention. This was published a couple of years ago. In 2020. Then there was also a big meta-analysis of over 300 clinical trials and studies by Professor Sauna Use that looked at risk factors and sort of ranked them and the size of the effect. And then there have been some other ones historically, and things that consistently come out as important. The most important protective factor ties directly into what I mentioned earlier, which is late life cognitive demand or cognitive stimulus. And then also, and what mainly pops up in these studies just because we have more data on it, is early life education. Because the longer you're in formal education early in life, the higher your peak of cognitive function. So even though it doesn't necessarily change the decline, unless you do some other things, if you start from a higher peak, then then at the same rate of decline, you reach functional impairment or dementia later in life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you have more to lose before you lose it.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that then fits into my idea of cognitive demand, right? We need to stimulate the brain as we develop it, but then also to maintain that long term. So those are probably the most important protective factors. And then the next one being, or maybe on the same level in terms of size of effect, is physical activity. And physical activity shows up in all of these meta-analyses as being critically important for long-term cognitive function. And that's defined broadly because you're sort of trying to lump these things together. Risk factors, some of the biggest risk factors, you see things like acute brain injuries like stroke and traumatic brain injury. But outside of those, hypertension is a really big one, as is diabetes or some aspect of metabolic disease, insulin resistance. And then nutrient status becomes really critical. So the ones that they've studied the most are probably, again, omega-3 status and homocysteine as a marker of B vitamin requirement, but also homocysteine itself may be detrimental to the brain mechanistically. There are a few things that it might do. And then beyond that, some of the other basics like iron status is really important. So anemia is a risk factor, vitamin D deficiency is a risk factor. And then you can sort of keep on adding nutrients that we know are important, but those are probably the ones that have the most evidence behind them.
When it comes to food for the brain, what would you say are some of the more beneficial foods to prioritize in one's diet?
I think whenever you get into this, people become ideologically entrenched based on the food itself. And when I talk about it, I think that the most important thing to focus on is the nutrients themselves, right? I'm agnostic to where you get them from, but I know that these nutrients are critical. Again, Food for the Brain as a charity was founded primarily with a focus on omega-3 fatty acids and then homocysteine lowering B vitamins. And it was largely founded again because of work by Professor David Smith, who's the former department chair of pharmacology at the University of Oxford, who ran the VitaCog trial, which was giving homocysteine lowering B vitamins, so it was B6, B9, folate, and B12 in individuals at high risk of cognitive impairment and some mild cognitive impairment. And what they saw was that in those individuals who had elevated homocysteine, especially if it was over 13, but probably over 11, so getting them below 11 slowed the rate of cognitive decline and slowed the rate of brain atrophy. But what was interesting is that it interacts with omega-3 status. And there are actually 3 studies that now show this. The B-Proof trial and the Omega-AD trial also showed something similar, which is that when you give just B vitamins to lower homocysteine, or you give just omega-3s, but you don't take the other into account, you don't necessarily see benefit. So you need both a good omega-3 status and you need to have homocysteine below sort of 11-ish in order to see benefit. And this goes back to, and depending on who you ask, some people say that the population attributable risk for dementia, when you combine both of these nutrients, is somewhere between like 20 and 40%. That sounds like a lot. My guess is it's less than that, but that's still a significant contribution to overall dementia risk at the population level. And this goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, which is that these different risk factors interact, right? And people will have seen dozens, if not hundreds, of clinical trials where they say, well, we gave this one thing and it didn't work, therefore it doesn't work. But we're now increasingly appreciating that context is critically important. So there are lots of studies that show omega-3 supplementation doesn't decrease dementia risk, but you haven't taken the status of these other nutrients into account. And I think it's very easy once you think about what you want that omega-3 fatty acid, so particularly DHA, but EPA is also important, what you think it's going to do. So you want that DHA to go in the brain. You want it to be in the synapses, in the mitochondrial membranes where it needs to be. But in order for it to get there, it needs several things, right? It needs to get into the brain in the first place, which probably requires some degree of metabolic health because some of the transporters are insulin dependent. Not all of them, but some of them. And then you need it to be attached into a phospholipid so it can sit in a membrane. So you need a phospholipid head group. So you need either choline or serine or ethanolamine in order to create that head group. And those, come from things like lecithin and eggs in particular. And then you need methylation to attach those things together and have them be functional. And so that's where the B vitamins come into play. So just thinking about these single nutrients, I think, kind of gets us in trouble. But those are maybe the most important ones. So then, if you eat a whole food plant-based diet, which a lot of people do, then you need to supplement with B12. And I think a lot of people, now we know that, right? And you need some kind of source of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids.
And what about choline? It's pretty hard to find choline on a plant-based diet, is it not?
Yeah, that's right. Unless you supplement with lecithin. So either sunflower or soy lecithin has a pretty good amount of choline. And then most of the DHA in the brain is not as phosphatidylcholine. It's either as phosphatidylserine or phosphatidylethanolamine. But they can be interconverted again if methylation is working properly. So usually what I'd say is if you do some testing, then you know whether you have higher requirements. So test your homocysteine, test your omega-3 status, because some people who do very well on plant-based diets, they have a more efficient conversion of ALA to the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids, but not everybody can do that. It's probably based on ancestry and some other things. So the easiest way to know what foods you should eat or what nutrients you should be focusing on is to try and do some basic blood testing.
Of course, but say you come across somebody who's not on social media, hasn't seen any nutrition-related documentary on Netflix, right? Doesn't have a Netflix account, hasn't been ideologically captured by any of the existing diet tribes, and they're like, Dr. Wood, what are the foods that I should prioritize on my next trip to the supermarket?
I would prioritize colorful fruits and vegetables and meat, eggs, and seafood.
And in terms of vegetables, because I know that this is a big, unusually contentious topic, right? What would you say for anybody who still doubts the benefits of fruits and vegetables, the presence of fruits and vegetables in one's diet? What would you say are the benefits of those?
There are several compounds that are very interesting. I think that there's a large debate over the utility and importance of fiber. I've actually contributed to that, published some studies where I think you show that, and when you look at the literature as a whole, I wouldn't say that fiber is an essential nutrient, but certainly, or essential in the diet for the gut to function, because actually the gut has other pathways by which it can be metabolically healthy and use ketones and these other things, and maybe some of the breakdown products of fats and amino acids that you might be getting more of if you're not eating fruits and vegetables. So I think that the gut can be healthy in the absence of fiber, but there certainly do seem to be some benefits there across a whole range of chronic conditions. But the things that interest me the most are the polyphenols and the carotenoids that you find in some of these, particularly berries, and then also the red and orange and yellow fruits and vegetables. They've been tested in randomized control trials in isolation, and many of them seem to improve cognitive function, like blueberry anthocyanins acutely and chronically improve cognitive function. You also see benefits with cranberries and strawberries, and then similar things, astaxanthin, zeaxanthin, lutein, although astaxanthin mainly comes from seafood, and then the others you can get from vegetables or eggs. But those, though, and how they work, they can have a direct effect in the brain. So some of the blueberry anthocyanins can seem to inhibit some sort of inflammatory and oxidative stress processes that go on in the brain. And again, this is like animal studies, so it's really difficult to say that that's directly relevant to humans. But there's also a lot of interesting effects. They seem to improve gut function, vascular function, and then related to that, obviously nitrates from fruits and vegetables. Nitrates in the context of fruits and vegetables, and the context of dietary nitrate is really important. But those then seem to be, in that context, important for particularly blood pressure, which we know is a critical risk factor for cognitive function. So I think there's a lot of evidence that fruits and vegetables can support health. I would focus on those that have those, carotenoids and polyphenols. They're probably slightly easier to digest, more soluble fiber rather than insoluble fiber. So some people who have sensitive guts might prefer those. But I think there's definitely enough evidence to say that there's still some benefit to be had there.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I'm a huge fan of dark leafy greens. I think, the carotenoids, as you've mentioned. I'm also, for the past decade, for the past, I would say like 15 or so years, I've been a huge fan of astaxanthin. I mean, aside from the purported brain health benefits and eye health benefits, I mean, it's great for your skin.
Yeah.
It's one of the most powerful antioxidants found in nature, and it's what gives salmon its like
Pink
characteristic,
color.
Pink color. I think that one of the most interesting parts of the astaxanthin story is that algae generated as a response to just sitting, at the surface of the water all day long, being exposed to the DNA damaging effects of the sun's rays. So they have to create. They can't move. They can't swim away.
Yeah.
These algal species. So they generate this incredibly powerful antioxidant that is then consumed by flamingos, by salmon, by shrimp, I'm sure, or because they're preyed upon by other myriad other species, and then we ingest that compound as a result. And there's a lot of really interesting research on it. It was actually astaxanthin was found as part of the NIH's nutrition interventions, the interventions testing program, to extend lifespan in male mice, which I thought was really interesting. It's one of the few compounds with a really high safety profile.
Yeah.
But also, it seems to be effective, at least in mice, in terms of extending lifespan.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing, and we actually we study this in the lab as well. We studied the sex effects of responses to brain injury in particular. And at least in rodents, I'm not sure how well it does extend to humans, but in rodents at least, males seem to be more susceptible, particularly to oxidative stress and the downstream negative effects of oxidative stress. So it would make sense that an antioxidant like astaxanthin, if it was going to affect one sex over the other, that you might see a greater benefit.
Is that why women tend to live longer? The females of the species tend to...
that's probably part of it. Yeah. I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure how well that translates to humans. Certainly, there are some things that I've seen in the lab where there's a sex effect in rats, and I did a. So I'll give the full story rather than just being vague about it. One of the studies I did in my PhD was looking at the effect of therapeutic hypothermia in a rat model of perinatal asphyxia. So it's basically baby gets the full term, like everything's perfectly normal, then something really bad happens during delivery, and there's an acute brain injury, like a global stroke, where you get decreased oxygen and blood flow to the brain. It creates a clinical scenario called hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. In babies that get this, the standard of care is therapeutic hypothermia, where you cool the baby down for 3 days. And you do that, you need to start within a few hours of birth or else it doesn't work. So if you start early and you cool them down for 3 days, then you get a significant reduction in both death and disability. In the rat model we had in the lab, I took, it was about 24 studies that we'd done over several years where we had two groups. We had a normal temperature group, and then we had a hypothermia group. And usually we were testing something else at the same time, but I just took those were our control groups. And I looked at the effect of sex on the response to hypothermia. And what I found was that there was a greater benefit in females than there was in males of hypothermia in the rats. And in clinical neonatology, there is this idea that the males always do worse. And it's just like baked into folklore. And when you look at long-term outcomes of like babies born preterm and babies who have some of these brain injuries, then yes, on average, the males do slightly worse. But what people were assuming was that they were responding differently to therapies. The therapy wasn't working as well in them. But actually, I've just performed this really big meta-analysis of all these original cooling trials that were used to develop hypothermia as standard of care in babies, in humans, and there's no effect of sex. So what I saw in the rats doesn't seem to be, or at least if there is an effect, it's not big enough to meaningfully change outcomes in humans. So all that goes to say that when we see some of these things in mice or in rodents, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate to the same thing in humans.
What's the mechanism by which cold exposure helps to support the brain in this context? And can that be translated to some of the potential benefits that we might derive from cold exposure as healthy adults, i.e. from cryotherapy or cold water immersion and the like?
So there are a few thoughts as to what's happening when you cool the brain in this scenario. One is a direct metabolic effect. And so when you have a brain injury, pretty much any acute brain injury, and it's the same for concussions and strokes and things like that, you within a few hours, you get this thing that they call a secondary energy failure. So essentially mitochondrial dysfunction that decreases the cells and the brain's ability to generate energy. And when you cool the brain down, you decrease metabolic demand. So you can better match demand to supply. And you also see the opposite. In fact, the opposite, there's much better evidence across all these brain injuries, is that if you have a fever, that makes the injury worse. And that's probably because you've increased the gap between demand and supply. But hypothermia also seems to have some anti-inflammatory effects. And then seems to have a direct effect on slowing cell death, particularly apoptotic cell death. So there are like many different ways that a cell can die, but apoptosis is like one of the classical cell death pathways, and that seems to be inhibited by hypothermia. What's interesting is that all those other types of brain injury that I mentioned, and they've done it in like cardiac arrest, stroke, traumatic brain injury, concussions, when they've tried hypothermia as a therapy, it hasn't really worked in adults. It works in babies, but it hasn't really worked in adults. What seems to be most important is, and because when you actively cool somebody, you're definitely going to stop them having a fever. So fever prevention seems to be the most important thing. There's some quibbles in the research, and still people say, well, they just didn't do the studies right, they didn't start early enough, they didn't cool for long enough, all those kinds of things. So that it could be that hypothermia is beneficial in some of those scenarios. And in many hospitals, say after out of hospital cardiac arrest, they might cool patients down, and they do still do that. And in some traumatic brain injuries, they do that. But the effect is not as good as it seems to be in babies. And part of that may be that the neonatal brain in particular is more primed for the cells to die via apoptosis, because apoptosis occurs naturally as we prune brain cells over time. So it could be partly related to just the differences in the stage of development of the brain. If you then sort of translate that to the effects of cold exposure and things like that, there are certainly some very interesting studies on cold exposure, cold water immersion. It's definitely used in athletes prior to sport as like a performance enhancer, because if you can keep core body temperature lower, you can usually extend performance. But then there seems to be some benefits in terms of particularly mental health and some other things, and maybe some acute changes in cognitive function. I think that the mechanisms are probably quite different. Part of the benefit of cold water immersion, I think, is that you've done something difficult, and it's actually really good for your brain to do difficult things, and know that you can do difficult things. There's both the physiological and then the psychological effect of that. But then equally, you get some release of adrenaline, noradrenaline, some of these factors that can improve arousal. That will certainly improve cognitive function acutely. So I think cold water immersion and can have some very interesting effects, but they're probably different from the neuroprotective effects that we see in brain injury.
I mean, cold water immersion for me is a state change, unlike anything else.
Yeah,
jumping into a cold tub, or even body of water, taking a cold shower, cryotherapy. I don't know if it has any long-term health impact. I think that's the big kind of looming question.
Yeah.
But I know that in the acute sense, it feels beneficial.
Yeah.
It feels beneficial. It's great for pain, aches, things like that as well. What about sauna use? There's a big question there. Because we've seen observational research showing that use is associated with reduced risk for age-related neurodegeneration, like Alzheimer's disease and things like that. But obviously that's correlation doesn't equal causation.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Those studies, and there's like one particular group, and it's the Finnish businessman study where they did all these sauna. They did all these sauna studies. I'm definitely interested in the possibility of sauna being useful for longevity and dementia prevention, but the reduction in risk that they see in those studies is just completely implausible. There is no way that going into the sauna 5 times a week decreases your risk of Alzheimer's disease by 2/3. Like I cannot believe that. There's nothing that's that good. And so I think a lot of the benefit, when people quote and they do that, they quote the exact dose and time and temperature that these guys spent in the sauna, and then the exact benefit that you should expect to get from that. I don't believe those things. They don't make statistical or biological sense. A lot of that benefit is probably what we call residual confounding, which is that the guys who can go to the sauna 5 times a week are different from the guys who can't go to the sauna 5 times a week and only go once a week or don't go at all. And that just hasn't been adequately controlled for statistically.
Reverse causation, right?
Yeah.
They're healthier.
Yeah, exactly.
So
they're healthier. There are other things in their life that are driving that. With that said, there are lots of things that sauna does seem to do. It parallels many of the benefits of aerobic exercise in particular, in terms of improving like cardiovascular function. We know that activating some of these heat stress pathways seems to improve, resilience to a whole range of things, and improve heat exposure improves, glycemic function, like particularly in those who have metabolic disease. But long term, that may be beneficial for those who don't even ever get diabetes. And then I think there's also benefit to sweating, right? It is one of our primary detoxification pathways, and it's very difficult to quantify, what you're sweating out and what effect that might have. But I think that there's probably some additional benefit from sweat and activating that as a primary detox pathway, because we know there are things that are going to accumulate in the body that may have a negative effect on either longevity or cognitive function, where sweat is the primary way that we eliminate them. So that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, sweating, pooping, peeing. These are all the primary routes of excretion in many of the compounds that we're ingesting and accumulating today.
And there have been some nice studies by people like Stephen Genuis, where he did the BUS study, the blood, urine, sweat study, where you can see that different heavy metals, different things, they're excreted through different pathways. And there are some things that are not excreted as well through urine and stool that are better excreted in sweat. So it's purely hypothetical at this point, but it kind of makes sense that regularly activating that detoxification pathway could be beneficial.
So you should be sweating on a regular basis.
Yes. Yeah.
See, I don't really sweat that often. I'm not like, some people, you could take 2 people, give them the same workout, and one will be drenched by the end of it.
Yeah.
And the other will be dry. And I'm one of those people that it takes a lot to get me to sweat even a little bit.
Maybe I'm just projecting, because I sweat so much that I'm just telling myself that it's a good thing. But and so again, I don't want people to worry if they're not sweaters, right? I think that the body is very good at adapting to these things, and it is very good at eliminating things. But there's an interesting, hypothetical benefit from at least finding some way to get sweaty occasionally.
Yeah. Are you a fan of neurotropics in general? And if so, any particular compounds that you find to be useful for boosting cognitive function acutely?
The short answer is no. And the main reason for that is that most times these things have been studied, or most of the nootropics that are sold to us haven't been adequately studied in the population that, like you or I. And there are some, like there was a period of time. Maybe they're maybe less sexy now, but the racetams are really popular a few years ago, and those have primarily been studied, and just a tiny bit in, say, people with Alzheimer's disease. Now it's peptides, which are just a whole other world of unregulated things that I'm probably not going to be injecting into my body anytime soon. But when you actually look at some of the function of these different compounds. And it depends. So if it's a true nootropic, so it's improving cognitive function, and it doesn't have, it doesn't generate dependence or tolerance, and it doesn't have any negative effects, there are actually very few compounds that are true nootropics in that sense. Most things, you may improve some aspect of cognitive function, but you might then be decreasing some other aspect of cognitive function. So if can be very tailored in terms of exactly what you're trying to do at this moment in time, and it's okay to lose some other aspect of cognitive function, then maybe it becomes interesting. But it's very rare where that's the case for me or for some of the people that I work with. There are some things that I am more likely to lean into. So creatine is one. I think that has a number of benefits, both in terms of acute cognitive function, offsetting some of the negative effects of sleep deprivation. It seems to have benefits for mood in those with depression. It probably has a greater effect in those who are already older or experiencing some element of cognitive decline. But that's something that I think is relatively safe and reasonable to recommend. The blueberry anthocyanins and some of the anthocyanins, some of those polyphenols have interesting effects on acute cognitive function, and I don't believe I've ever seen any downsides. And you can actually get them from doses that you can just get from real food. So a couple of cups of wild blueberries will get you the right dose. You don't need to be necessarily supplementing. So these things where we can get them from, where you could reasonably get them from the diet, but then sometimes it's just easier to supplement. Those are more likely to have the positive asymmetry that I'm looking for. So a high positive asymmetry being high potential for benefit with very, very low risk, which is kind of where I tend to focus on a lot of these things. Then one of the interesting aspects of this, and it relates to what I mentioned earlier about some of these trade-offs, is that particularly with stimulants, and there aren't very many people who would call like caffeine a nootropic because it's not, but when people use stimulants to enhance cognitive function, generally complex cognitive functions are actually getting worse. You can see an improvement in something like a psychomotor vigilance, which is generally tested with a reaction time test. So in a simple cognitive task like that, you see increases with stimulants, so caffeine, but they've also done it with things like methylphenidate and modafinil. These are other stimulants as well. There are some recent studies on this. So you see in simple task performance, like reaction time, you see an improvement. But in complex task performance, you actually see a decrease in performance, whilst the person feels they get an elevation in mood and they feel like they're performing better. So there becomes a dissociation between how you think you're performing and how you're actually performing. So this, I think, has led to a lot of the folklore around nootropics, which is that people feel good, but they're not actually performing better. And so that's why there are very few things that I recommend in terms of supplementing for cognitive enhancement, because most of them are probably just making you feel better, but not making you perform better, and at worst may actually be making you perform worse.
Wow. Do you have any thoughts on nicotine? A lot of people obviously use nicotine via very unhealthful routes of administration,
Yeah.
right? Obviously smoking. But it's also now trending because there are these nicotine extract products on the market that are tobacco free.
Yeah, I think it's not something that I generally recommend, but there is some positive data on it, and particularly could be useful in the setting of things like learning and memory and coding, because we know that those are so dependent on acetylcholine signaling, and that's obviously where nicotine acts, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. So I think that if you're smart about it and you're using it in a very selected way, so like you really need to learn this thing right now, and it's then worth it to take some nicotine. I'm certainly interested in those effects, and isolated nicotine supplementation doesn't seem to have negative effects, or at least nowhere near as the same as smoking or vaping or these other. So if you're taking it lingually or a gum or something like that. But again, it's interesting to me as a neuroscientist, but it's not necessarily something like a strategy that I'm going to recommend to people regularly.
Well, there are definitely risks. I mean,
Yeah.
it's highly addictive. It has, I think, potentially, it has effects on the cardiovascular system that I think are likely negative. I mean, the acute raise in blood pressure and heart rate. It's vasoconstrictive. Although, interestingly about nicotine, it seems to be vasodilatory and to muscle tissue, but interestingly vasoconstrictive everywhere else.
Yeah, it just depends on what the downstream transmitters released are from the upstream one. I think if you're trying to, and this is again, the negative effects again much smaller if you're supplementing in the quote unquote right way compared to smoking. But if you're trying to activate these same pathways, we know how to do that without taking nicotine, and part of it is getting to the right level of arousal, like we talked about partly earlier, and that cold water could do it. Brief bouts of exercise can do it. We know that non-exhaustive exercise acutely boosts cognitive function.
What does that mean? Exercise that's just like not super
yeah. So
how do you describe that?
Yeah, if when they've done these studies, it's generally somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. I think most studies do about 20 minutes of a fairly standard jog or bike at like 70% of VO2 max or something like that. But they've also done studies with like high intensity interval training, like intermittent sprints. But when you then look at studies where they completely fatigue the muscle, and there are some grip strength studies and some other sprint studies. So if you like completely exhaust yourself, and you could probably appreciate that, like if you've ever like really hit the red line in exercise, your brain doesn't function very well afterwards. But if you do some of those, if you do a lower intensity of exercise, and again, you'll often people say, oh, I feel energized after my run. That's the kind of intensity we're talking about. That seems to acutely benefit cognitive function, and it's probably because you're activating some of those same pathways. So I think that some of these things that we might do with supplementation, we can manipulate physiology, and we could do it with breath work, we could do it with exercise, we could do it with cold. There are lots of different ways to increase the release of some of these neurotransmitters that don't require supplementation. And then the final key piece to this is probably like we talked about, if you're trying to learn something, then making mistakes is one of the ways that we start to release more acetylcholine and noradrenaline in the brain, which is essentially what you're trying to do when you're taking something like nicotine in order to drive some of those learning pathways. So I think that we can achieve these states without having to supplement.
You can like prime your brain.
Yeah.
Very useful before, a big test or presentation or appearance on a podcast or what have you.
Yeah, and this is something that I've been working on a lot with in Formula One recently. And most of the work I do in Formula One is through a company called Hints of Performance. They provide coaches to the drivers, and the coach is like the 24/7 a day body person who's like there all the time. They're holding the helmet next to the car. They're running nutrition. They're running training. They're looking after their sleep, diary, all this kind of stuff. And I do a lot of work with the coaches, and we've been thinking recently about how do we create scenarios where we've optimally manipulated physiology before the driver gets in the car such that they're at the right level of arousal to perform at their best. And when you think about arousal and performance, you probably heard of the Yerkes-Dodson arousal curve.
No, what is that?
Yeah, okay, so now I get to tell you a story about an interesting mouse study as well, but in order to set this up. So Yerkes and Dodson, more than 100 years ago, they did this study in mice, which was about learning. And they had two different conditions that the mice had to learn. And they had a simple one and a complex one. So now, when I'm talking earlier about simple and complex cognitive tasks, this all essentially goes back to this original experiment. And what they did was that to increase arousal like the level of focus in these mice, they gave them electric shocks. And what they found was that for a simple task, you could just give bigger and bigger shocks, and they'd still, there was kind of like a plateau effect, but there wasn't a negative effect in terms of learning the simple task. But when they were learning the complex task, there was some improvement in learning up to a point of arousal, or the intensity of the electric shocks, and then it became detrimental. Like they became so stressed by the shocks that they could no longer learn the complex task. And this is essentially the same for any sport or anything we might do with our brains, right? You need enough arousal and stimulus so that you're engaged and focused, but too much, and then you're anxious, you're stressed. It's kind of the difference between, one end it's like you just woke up, it's very difficult to get engaged in something, but the other end it's you've had 20 espressos and you're sort of overstimulated, and then it's difficult to focus and be engaged. So there's this bell-shaped curve of arousal along the bottom and performance on the side. And then when you're at the top of that curve, as an athlete, there are different states that you can achieve. So the one that's probably most common is called the clutch state, which is when you're performing really well, but it's still a significant effort, right? You're still having to work hard to achieve it. And that essentially becomes cognitively exhausting eventually. You can also, through that, achieve the flow state, which is the maximal expression of a learned complex skill. And, everything's effortless and it just sort of flows from one to the other. But both of those states require this optimal level of arousal. And each person and each sport, that's going to be different. So the amount of arousal you're going to see on the start line of the 100-meter final in the Paris Olympics is going to be very different from the final of archery, right? Both of those, all those athletes are at the top of their game. They're the best in the world, but they need very different states in order to perform at their best. And so there are also going to be differences in terms of how people come in. So we have athletes who get very anxious and stressed. Even though they're professionals, they're doing what they do, they still get anxious before a race. So they need to find ways to calm them down. You need to bring them down into the middle of the curve. And there are others who need to get them amped up. And you need to move them up into that. So then it all becomes about how can we manipulate that? And sometimes the supplements, we might use a little bit of caffeine, but we've definitely seen in Formula One drivers, they take too much caffeine, they make mistakes, as we'd expect from that kind of model. But then how do we use exercise, breath work, meditation, cold exposure, just to get somebody in that kind of optimal zone so that they can perform at their best?
What are some potential ways to reduce anxiety?
The few things that have seemed to work, and often it's some of the opposites of the things we talked about before, but definitely slow-paced breathing or slow-paced breath work seems to help. There are some athletes who really like some kind of biofeedback, and it could be using heart math, it could be using the Muse, it could be using electrodermal activity, like anything like that just requires you to sort of like focus inwardly seems to help. And then we know that you can use bright light exposure to increase arousal. You can also use dark, and you can use cold to increase arousal. You can also use like dark and warmth to kind of like calm people down as well. Although obviously you don't want to go too far in that direction. So a lot of it becomes very much, and then another big part is routine, right? If you generate a routine, and a lot of top level athletes are very superstitious because they have the thing that works for them. And then the potential downside is that if the routine can't be put in place, then obviously that can increase anxiety. So there's a balance to be had there. But having some expectation of these are the things that I will do and they will make me perform will then make you perform well. So it comes down to personal preference, because there are a lot of times when you're talking to a coach or a driver and you're like, this would be really good for you, and they're like, I'm not going to do that. So then you have to come up with some other ideas. And then it's then just tailoring it to the individual.
Are there any compound supplements that have evidence in terms of an effect on anxiety? I know theanine is fairly commonly used.
Yeah, theanine is something that some of the drivers who get anxious have used, at least a couple. That's probably the one that I would most routinely use. And
theanine, interesting.
Yeah. Other than that, The number of supplements, well, first that you can recommend to athletes who are drug tested is pretty small, right? They have to be third party tested, so NSF for Sport or Informed Sport if you're in in Europe, and there just aren't that many options. But there are some nice data on theanine decreasing anxiety and stress in sort of in acutely stressful situations that sometimes it can be helpful.
Any idea of like a dose or? Because I know.
Yeah, it's somewhere between like 100 to 250 milligrams, something like that.
People also take that before sleep sometimes.
Yeah. I actually sometimes, if I've consumed too much caffeine during the day, that's something that I'll sometimes take before bed. I wouldn't routinely use it before bed unless somebody was very anxious. You could consider it. But that's the one as like an antidote. Maybe if I had too much caffeine, that's something I take occasionally.
Interesting. Is THC helpful or?
Well, obviously I can't recommend that to professional athletes.
Right. Right. But from the standpoint of us civilians as a, potential sleep aid, a means of decreasing anxiety.
I think
I'm not, and for the record, I'm not a fan of THC.
Yeah.
But I will take because it makes me, I feel crazy on it. So I'll never take it socially, but I do find that a little bit, like a very small dose helps sometimes before bed if I'm having trouble just turning off my brain.
There are some studies on the combination of THC and CBD for sleep. Most of them are in like disease populations, so people with neurodegenerative conditions or something like that. There may be some benefit. I'm probably more interested in the non-psychoactive cannabinoids. They seem to have some broader cognitive benefits, although they're not readily available yet. It's kind of that research is being done. But for a long period of time, people were talking about CBD for sleep and recovery. There's basically no evidence for that. And CBD in isolation can be arousing. It can actually worsen sleep, particularly in higher doses. If there is any evidence of benefit, it's a combination of THC and CBD seems to improve sleep. But again, this is probably in diseased populations rather than the average individual. So it's, again, this isn't necessarily good evidence for it one way or the other.
Yeah, I think I've seen studies that suggest that high doses actually can reduce the amount of time spent in REM sleep.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, for people listening, obviously you're a wealth of information. Where would you say, what are the top 3 things that somebody listening to this should start doing today to improve their brain health and improve their odds long term for the development of conditions like dementia, Alzheimer's disease?
The most important one is probably to start doing things that you're bad at, that you suck at. Start learning some new complex skill and practice that regularly. And it could be language, it could be dance, it could be a musical instrument, it could be any of those. It could be a new sport. All of those things are fantastic. Something that you enjoy, maybe you can do socially, that you'll regularly do. And then as you get better, maybe you pick up a new skill or try and develop some mastery there. I think that's, like I said, those complex skills, learning those, being bad at those, getting better at those, I think is a significant primary driver of cognitive function. Then the next thing is, and your audience is obviously going to be very familiar with this, and we talked about it, is like do some basic blood tests for nutrient status, metabolic health, cardiovascular health. Like, it doesn't need to be anything super fancy, although I would get a homocysteine, which is less commonly tested, but certainly not hard to get. And the other things we mentioned, like I didn't mention magnesium, but that's important. Vitamin D, iron, omega-3 status, those kinds of things. And then I think what's going to be my third thing? Lift weights. I'm going to say lift weights. And
all right, I love that.
The reason why I'm going to say that is primarily because we just put together this interesting paper that kind of tells the story of the trajectory of the structure and function of certain aspects of the brain in those who are at risk of Alzheimer's disease, and particularly the white matter structure of the brain, which is responsible for the fast connections between like the cortex on the outside and then the deep brain underneath and then the rest of the body. it seems to be particularly responsive to resistance training in those who haven't lifted weights before. That you improve the structure and function of the white matter in people, and this is in older individuals. Like they've done it in perimenopausal and postmenopausal women, and then also both in men and women in their sort of 60s and 70s. So it's, we talked about sex effects earlier. Again, you see that in rodents. I think this is for everybody, regardless of sex or gender. So the benefits seem to come if you're training twice a week. So there is like a dose response, and that's been shown in a couple of studies. Twice a week, and we're talking 5 or 6 exercises that cover the whole body. 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps, just like super, super basic. You could do it with machines, you could do it with free weights, whatever. And obviously you want to progress and get stronger over time. And the benefits seem to arise if you do it for at least 6 months. So join a dance class and lift weights, and then go see your doctor for a blood test. Those are my 3 things.
I love that. And when lifting weights, I mean, should you strive towards a certain degree of intensity?
So you probably want to get, in reality, most of the evidence now suggests that the repetitions matter less as long as you're approaching something like voluntary muscular failure. So you get to the point where you probably can't do another good 2 reps. Maybe you like squeeze out 1 more. Like that's probably a good place to stop. So it does need to be difficult. But you probably see similar muscle building benefits regardless of the number of repetitions, as long as you're sort of approaching failure towards the end. So if people who don't lift weights don't think about it in terms of RPE, so like rate of perceived exertion, or RER, reps in reserve, but essentially get to the point where it's hard and you probably can't do more than another 1 or 2 reps. That's a good target point.
You got to challenge yourself.
Yes, it's got to be difficult.
Yeah. It's so important. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make, actually.
Yeah.
They don't, they'll lift weights, but they're not lifting weights with sufficient intensity to send that stimulus to their muscles to adapt.
And I think there's a couple of important things that we can briefly cover. One is that people who don't regularly lift weights usually underestimate their capacity. Like you're stronger than you think you are. And they've done studies on this showing that novice lifters can do more than they think they can. And then the next is injury risk. And everybody's always worried about injuries with lifting weights. But traditional bodybuilding style training, like especially with machines, but also with free weights, is one of, like, other than walking, is one of the lowest injury risk physical activities that you can do. And the risk of getting back pain from being sedentary is much, much higher than from lifting weights. It's also, and I don't want to discourage people from running, but the risk of injury from running is also something like 6 to 20 times higher than it is from lifting weights. If you take completely untrained individuals and you make one, they haven't directly compared them, but if you look at these studies, if you take people who haven't trained before and then they start a running program versus a bodybuilding program, you see much higher injury rates in the running program.
Wow.
So that's not to discourage people. It's just that being sedentary causes pain and injury. But the risk is much lower if actually you're active, and part of that includes lifting weights. So I don't think people should be as worried about injury risk lifting weights as they often are.
Yeah. Wow. That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, lifting is I mean, I think there are certainly more technical exercises that are promoted in a way that sometimes, at least to me, feels very maybe too cavalier on social media. Deadlifting and squatting. I mean, a lot of people think of these movements as something that you should innately know how to do with perfect form. But a lot of people do get injured via squatting and deadlifting and things like that, and bench pressing as well.
Yeah, it's often people going on like beyond their current capacities. So it's often driven by ego, which I think a lot of the people that hopefully we're speaking to right now and we're encouraging to go and lift for the first time, I think that's unlikely to be their issue, honestly. But of course, there are always risks. But A deadlift is just picking something up off the floor, and you want to be able to do that until you're 90 or 100, right? So these are like, you're right, a back squat or a front squat is a complex movement that you don't necessarily need to do in the gym. You can do a leg press, but a deadlift is something that we all need to do every day. So finding some way to safely do that and improve your capacity there, I think, is important.
Yeah, like in one way or another, you're literally probably deadlifting every day.
Yeah.
We just don't think of it as such.
Yeah.
I just became an uncle a couple of like 2 years ago now. But a fascinating observation, and you're an expert in the neonatal brain, which is so interesting to me that when I'm observing my little niece, her name is Kayla, she's about 2 years old. If she is attempting to pick up something off the floor, I have not once seen her bend over to pick the thing up off the floor.
Yeah.
She's constantly squatting.
Yeah.
Constantly. And then deadlifting essentially to pick the thing up the floor. She's never curling her back over the way that we as adults do. Not once.
Yeah. And I think these movement patterns are sort of inherently baked into us, and we lose them as we get older. And I think part of it is because we're not, like with everything I've said multiple times today, right? If you're not using it, then you lose it. And then as you start to get stiff and you lose mobility, and you're sitting all day, and then you immediately load that in the gym. Of course, it creates an injury risk. But if we start to, or hopefully maintain so we never lose, but you start to focus on some of these basic movement skills again, and then you can add load to them, I think there's just huge benefits you're going to get from that.
Yeah. Amazing. And are you a fan of, you mentioned magnesium and vitamin D. Do you supplement with these micronutrients? Yeah,
I take magnesium every night before bed.
What form?
I take it as glycinate for two reasons. One is that it's the most bioavailable form that's also relatively inexpensive. And two is that, particularly those who are very physically active, they tend to have a higher glycine requirement. So I get a couple of grams of glycine with my magnesium for free, along the way. So that's kind of like more bang for your buck. There are other forms of magnesium. They're mainly overblown in terms of what they can and can't do for the brain. So like magnesium glycinate tends to be my favorite.
3 and 8, you're not a fan? There's a lot of hype around 3 and 8, and
it's not that I'm not a fan. It's just that there's no evidence that it's actually any better. Like, it's based on one not very good rat study in Neuron for like 12 years ago. Neuron, the journal, and like when you look at kind of like the process of how they selected 3 and 8 and how they compared it to other magnesiums, it just wasn't a very good study. And so there are studies that show in humans 3 and 8 has some benefit, but nobody has ever been able to explain to me why having some threonine around at the same time as the magnesium, because they're going to dissociate in the gut, they're not bound to each other, how that increases like more magnesium in the brain. Nobody can explain that. So until somebody actually can explain that, I think it's just an expensive way to get magnesium. It is bioavailable. You are getting magnesium. That's great. I just don't think it's any better than some of the other bioavailable cheaper forms.
Yeah, I agree. I take magnesium glycinate primarily. It's my primary, the form that I take. And I agree, getting glycine is, whether through collagen supplementation or taking free-form glycine, which I do sometimes before bed, I feel like it really helps sleep, and there's some clinical data to support that. Super interesting. Well, Dr. Tommy Wood, this was fascinating, man. You are a wealth of knowledge. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a huge pleasure. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, so it was really nice to be able to sit down with you.
Thank you, brother. I love to hear that. I've got one last question for you, but before we get to that, where can people connect with you on social media? How can they support your work?
The best place to find me is primarily on Instagram, at Dr. Tommy Wood. I post papers we publish there. I post podcast interviews and things like that. I also have my own podcast, the Better Brain Fitness Podcast, which I do with Dr. Josh Turknett, who I mentioned a couple of times. And we also have a free Substack where all the articles and podcasts and things we do, people can get access to there. It's betterbrain.fitness.
Love it. What does living a genius life mean to you?
Again, I just have to go back to those two things, which is being like engaged in the world in a way that stimulates your brain and you can express the skills and the things that you love to do. So that requires you to both build some skills and then go out into the world and express them. And then that ultimately is genius to me. You can't measure it on an IQ test, but I think it's a much more important expression of cognitive function than anything else.
Love it.